Okay, thank you. So I present on the Americas, and perhaps, just a geography lesson. The Americas are often referred to as the Western Hemisphere, in other words, half of the planet. So I've got a bit of a difficult mission here to get that into 20 minutes. And actually, when I put this to Andy Evis, he said, but Chris, it's only British exploration in the Americas. And that kind of underlines the point. It's quite easy to actually underestimate what Brits have done on this part of the planet. Where else are you going to find naked cavers making the front cover of national newspapers and astronauts joining caving expeditions? In contrast to other parts of the world that you've been hearing about, there haven't been long-standing expeditions that are run decade after decade. And actually, a lot of the collaboration has been between British, American, Canadian cavers working with locals as well. You'll also see, I think, that in the early years, a lot of the exploration revolved around a few key people who acted as catalysts and focal points. So you'll see the same names coming up again and again. So our story starts in Jamaica in 1965, when Mike Boone, Pete Livesey, Titch Morris, and Raymond Stoyles went out there. And they actually spent 6 months in Jamaica, 1965, 6 months doing cave exploration. The trip was a follow-up to a Leeds University trip there in 63, and it took them 2 whole weeks on a Royal Mail line boat just to get there. Apparently they had 9 huge packing cases, and they obviously were a little bit worried about the food, because 8 of these cases were full of tinned food. So over a total of 6 months, they mapped and explored around 80 miles of passages, which included Quashie's River Cave.
The first one we looked at was a cave called Quashie's River Sink, which was an enormous shake hole, the vertical sides, and we had to climb down the narrowest bit on lianas and things like that to get to the bottom, which was big enough. It had a banana plantation in the bottom. And the river came down a very, very narrow cleft at the top, ran down, and then straight into this big cave mouth, which was, 70 foot wide and about 50, 60 foot high, yeah. And then from there, it just went in a succession of whacking great big pitches, yeah, about 400 foot deep, yeah.
So after the expedition, Titch ended up with a job at McMaster University in Canada, where Professor Derek Ford from the UK had recently arrived at the Department of Geography and Geology. Derek started a campaign to investigate caves in the Rockies, and he actually invited Mike Boone to work as a paid assistant. And in the summer of '66, Boone brought his friend Mike Shawcross, who brought his friend Gary Pilkington, who brought his friend Peter Thompson, and so on. And it actually became a focus for kind of expat cavers, working out in the Rockies. And between 66 and 76, they scoured the Canadian Rockies for caves with great success. However, one of the most significant projects started in '66 when they made a series of exploration trips into a cave called Castleguard, now Canada's longest cave. And this actually included Mike and Peter Thompson being flooded in.
The team leader is Derek Ford, 39. A specialist in cavern genesis and professor of geography at McMaster University, some 2,000 miles away.
Caving is a great sport. I'm a professional geographer because I fell in love with climbing mountains and exploring caves and decided to turn it into a profession if I could, and was lucky enough to do so.
Titch Morris is a master carpenter by trade. He's the team cook by default.
I first started climbing, but I found that caving was a lot more interesting. Well, with climbing, you can pick your route out and study it from a safe position and then go ahead and climb it. Whereas underground, you find your handholds and your footholds as you get to them.
We knew from the beginning that the cave flooded, but we didn't really know under what conditions. Unfortunately, we found out firsthand, Mike Boone and myself. So it was in summer, and where you have nice ice crawls now, there was 3 to 5 feet of water in the passage. And it was at that point that I started to get worried, because I heard this running water. So we just kept on wading until the water getting deeper until eventually it just met the roof, and we realised that the cave was flooded and there was no way out. So we found the most comfortable spot we could on a sandy floor, and we scooped out a small hollow and built it up around with rocks to try and conserve a bit of heat, and then sort of snuggle down to it and snuggle up to each other and try to keep warm as best we could.
So they obviously did get out, I should point out, but I don't have time to hear the full story. Sid Peru was invited to make this film in '73, and because he was commissioned by Parks Canada, he wasn't able to make mention of a controversial exploration by Mike Boone because it was a solo trip, but it's often regarded as one of the greatest feats of solo exploration. Mike pushed the cave to the final plug, glacial plug under the glacier. So fast forward, however, 39 years, and the Brits were back in an expedition led by Martin Groves with Canadian support. Martin Groves led an expedition in 2009 to dive the sump in what's called Boone's Blunder. In 2009, Martin laid out around 500 meters of line in the sump, and he returned in 2010 and laid out a further 400 meters. And he actually then surfaced in a large ongoing passage. Now, he chose not to dekit and take his diving gear off at that point because he was a bit worried about damaging it and how difficult it was going to be to put it back on and go back, you know, because he was on his own. So he returned in 2011 with a fellow diver, but unfortunately the ice crawls, an example of which you can see in the top left, those ice crawls were full to the roof. So nobody, even to this present day, has been back to carry on the exploration of Castle Guard to go beyond that point where Martin turned back. So, staying with our McMaster University expat cavers, but going back in time, in 1966, Titch Morris, again, using him as our catalyst, actually attended an American caving convention and actually heard about caving in Mexico, caving in Huautla. And I quite like the quote here, which is interesting to consider that back in the mid-'60s, the Texan cavers were exploring here, and they were looking at British cavers for kind of advice and information about techniques and approaches for the kind of caves that they were finding down in Mexico. So in Christmas '67, 6 cavers from McMaster University, including Titch, Mike Boone, Pete Thompson, they went down to Huautla, and they joined up with the American expedition. And then in '68, they were back to take part in the San Agustin exploration. And I particularly like this quote from Boone. "It could produce some very deep caves, possibly deep enough to satisfy our lust for record breaking, but lust is never satisfied, only abated." And sure enough, the caving there certainly didn't stop. The majority of the exploration at this point was done by American teams, so particularly Bill Stone's US deep caving team. But I mention it here because we had key UK divers and cavers taking part in these trips. From Rob Parker joining the 1984 trip to Pina Colorada, Ian Rowland in San Agustin in '94, Rick Stanton and Jason Mallinson out in the Huautla Resurgence, and then Rick and Jason out in Cheve. And I bring this up because actually these are really part of a continuing story of British involvement in this area, which actually laid the way for us to go there and mount a major expedition in 2013. So in 2013, we put together a major trip. There were 40 people, 40 cavers, again, collaboration with American cavers, Canadian cavers, to go back to San Agustin, to dive Sump 1 and Sump 2, set up a camp beyond those sumps, and spend a week exploring and pushing in the final sump in the cave, Sump 9, photo of Jason Mallinson diving here, and successfully extended the depth of the cave on our final dive, reaching a depth of minus 81 meters, 440 meters into that sump. And that re-established Sistema Huautla as the deepest cave in the Western Hemisphere. But our involvement didn't stop there. More recently, British divers have got involved in projects in this area, this time in the Huautla Resurgence, so where the water comes back out of the mountain and we were there in 2016 and 2017. Remember, Rick and Jason were there in fact, 2001, so this is all part of that continuing story. The Huautla resurgence is now 1.4 kilometers of diving, and leading on from Jason Mallinson's end of line point, in 2016 we reached surface and came up into a large air chamber, and this year we went back with the team and spent, or had two teams camping there for 3 or 4 days at a time, exploring and mapping this bit of the cave. In fact, things continue, and we'll be going back to this region in 2018. Not to this particular cave, but back to Pina Colorada, which was last visited in '84, when Bill Stone led his trip there, when Rob Parker was so instrumental and so important. So, British exploration continuing. Now to another part of Mexico, but starting with our diving theme and our connection actually to Rick and Jason again. So this time, moving north up to a region called Cuetzalan. So early exploration here was in the 70s, and it was carried out by a mix of teams from the US, UK, Belgium. But after things died down, they restarted in '91, led by people like Tim Allen, when he was part of the NCC. Between '91 and 2004, something like 8 expeditions. A lot of them a collaboration between British and Mexican cavers. And by that point, around 100 kilometers of cave passage had been mapped, surveyed, and explored. The expeditions, however, had to stop in 2004, when a group of cavers, part of the Combined Services Caving Association, were trapped by rising water in a cave called Alpazat. Now, the risk of flooding was well known, and actually before the trip, the expedition leader, Jonathan Sims, had actually said to Rick Stanton, look, we might get trapped, there's a sensible risk of this, would you act as our contingency plan and come out and rescue us? And Rick obviously said, yeah, no problem, but he did forget to tell Jason. So in 2004, when they had to go out there, it was a little bit of a surprise to Jason, but out they went. It was obviously a major rescue, and it became headlines all over the world. And you can see the media circus that collected outside the cave there. It made the newspapers over here, it made the BBC, it made the news and so on. And cavers, never missing an opportunity to have a bit of fun, took this photo, which later appeared on the front page of, I think, of a national newspaper. Staying with our diving theme, but actually going back to 1980, but this time something a bit more tropical, to the Caribbean, to the Bahamas. And here you've got a series of caves that exist underneath the islands, and seafloor, entrances in shallow creeks, inland lakes, and actually out in the sea. From the late 50s, George Benjamin, Canadian cave diver, led a lot of exploration efforts here with various US divers. However, between '81 and '87, British divers mounted a series of exploration expeditions featuring a lot of the top divers of the day. Notable cave divers Martin Farr and Rob Palmer were among the small team that initiated the project back in '81. And after their success, they returned in '82 with a much larger team of 14 people, including a film crew and several scientists. And actually, Martin achieved a depth record of a penetration of a submarine cave on his dive in Conch Sound Blue Hole after reaching 1,150 meters, using apparently some 23 cylinders. Palmer returned in '83, and then again in '84 on the Zodiac expeditions, when Rob Parker and Julian Walker joined him. And then in '86 and '87, Rob also led expeditions to Andros as part of the Andros trips. These were scientific and exploration expeditions involving a lot of deep diving as well. At sites such as Stargate, they reached depth around 98 meters. And the Andros project actually saw the first use of the Carmellum rebreather and saw extensive use of heliox gas as well. So it's a great example of British divers pioneering techniques which have now become very common and established. Keeping our diving theme going, somewhere a little bit different, Lechuguilla in New Mexico is normally associated with American exploration efforts. Apart from one perhaps small footnote, or small but significant, in 1992, Pete Bolt mounted a trip with 24 English, Welsh, American and Canadian cavers to dive the Lake of the White Roses. It took around 2 weeks to set up and complete the dive, but Pete reached a depth of 92 feet, 28 meters, which actually set up Lechuguilla at that time to be the deepest cave in the US. So, small but significant contribution. So, trying to wrap up now, but I'm going to pick up on a couple of final places. In Belize, there have been 7 expeditions between 2001 and 2013. Cavers from South Wales and Bradford Pothole Club having some fantastic success. Taking wonderful photos as well and mapping lots of passage. And in Peru, we've seen interest since 1972, going right back to then, when the Imperial College Caving Club visited the country. They returned in 84 and 88. And more recently, the BEC and others have organized trips in 2001, 2002, a big trip in 2004 to see Mapuma Kocha, and then an international trip later in 2012, which established a lot of very high altitude cave entrances. So, only a few minutes left. I just want to take my last little moments to finish on an interesting story. On its caving merits, the 1979 trip to Los Tejas wouldn't normally feature in an account of British exploration. But I like it here for its curiosity benefit. It's a wonderful example of how caving and caving expeditions can take you into some quite remarkable situations. So, in '79, a large expedition of scientists and soldiers from Britain and Ecuador was being put together. It was arranged by a Scottish engineer, Stan Hall, and he was searching for this mythical metal library. Hall was taken by a notion that these caves were somehow artificial, stretched the whole length of the Andes, and were made by an extraterrestrial race who had thermic lances and nuclear weapons. So slightly unusual expedition to get involved with. 7 weeks before the trip was due to depart, they realized they only had 3 cavers. 2 of them being scientists and 1 of them in the army. So rather hastily, some other cavers were arranged to take part. The entrance was bottomed out after about 45 meters, and the rest of the cave was explored pretty quickly. In total, about 5 kilometers of cave, down to a depth of 180 meters. And then the cavers then basically spent the rest of their trip manning a winch, taking the scientists and the soldiers up and down the shaft. However, the highlight for me, and I'll flick through some of the photos. The highlight for me, really, and the reason to include it, is that, partway through the expedition's figurehead arrived. None other than Neil Armstrong. Yes, first man on the moon. And Neil was taken on a caving trip by Pete Holden. And here is Neil enjoying his sandwich at the sump. So, great example of how caving can take you to interesting places, meet fantastic people. There's some wonderful caving to do in the Americas. And if you get an opportunity to get out to this bit of the world, I encourage you. Thank you.
Perfect. Well done.